Hi, Victoria. How are you?
Hello, Katarina. I'm fine. How are you? Thank you.
Good, good. Thank you.
I'm looking forward to this evening. It should be so interesting.
Yes, me too. I'm very excited.
So we're here kind of early, and this is the time when maybe we, I don't know, open the windows, turn on the heater, adjust the chairs, make sure everyone's comfy.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And we'll start the room in around 5 minutes, and then I'll be introducing the two guest speakers, and then Victoria will be asking them some questions so that we all get to know them a little bit better. Um, and that will be interesting. And then they will be talking about this huge study that they did. This was the biggest psychedelic study that has ever been performed. So I'm very interested in hearing about it. Hi, Dennis. How are you?
Hi, Katarina. Very good. Hi, Victoria. Looking forward to this chat. I was reading over some of the prelim data, and it was very interesting.
Hey, Dennis. Nice to see you.
Very cool. I see some of the regulars here. Hopefully some other people will be joining us as we get started. One request, if you find value in the discussions, please hit the share button. It's the square with this arrow pointing out of it so that we can have more ears in here and have that going for us.
Welcome, Danilo. Thank you for coming. If you accept the invitation to speak, uh, you can. Hi,
Okay,
how are
how about
you?
now?
Thank you. Yep, now I hear you.
Okay,
How are you
okay, that's
doing?
good. Pretty good, pretty good. Let me see. Let me see whether the Wi-Fi is better or G5. Typically, it's not the Wi-Fi. There we go. So we're missing Manesh.
Yeah, we'll wait another few minutes. So, I wanted to
Hmm.
thank you again for coming, of course, and I wanted to ask you. We had like an idea to start that we wanted to start with today. We always
Hmm.
feel like the guest speakers don't get like our audience don't get to know them very well.
Hmm. Hmm.
So Victoria had this great idea that she would start maybe with a few questions like how did you get to be interested in science or your subject. So I hope that's okay with you. We always think like people should get to know the scientist a little bit better and
Mm-hmm.
gets lost. So if that's okay, we'll
Sure,
do.
yeah, why not?
Oh, hi Manish. Welcome. Thank you for coming.
Hey, thank you. My pleasure.
There he is.
Yeah, so we can slowly start. I'll, welcome to the Science Society, and I want you to introduce you to Victoria. She is a wonderful moderator, much better than I am.
Oh, no, 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 no.
Yeah.
We don't do that.
But
So humble.
yeah, let me just introduce you really quick to the audience a little bit about your background, and then Victoria can take over. So um, please, everyone, meet Manish Giran. He's a psychedelic scientist. He's currently a PhD student in neuroscience at the McGill University and has been the lead or co-author on over a dozen scientific publications already as a PhD student, and book chapters on topics including psychedelics, meditation, daydreaming, and the default network. He's currently doing research on the brain mechanisms underlying LSD, psilocybin, and DMT in collaboration with Dr. Robin Carhart Harris and others from the Imperial College London. And he also runs a very successful YouTube channel called The Psychedelic Scientist, where he discusses the latest findings in psychedelic science. And also meet Dr. Danilo Bzdok. He's a medical doctor by training with a dual background in system neuroscience and machine learning statistics. And after medical training at the Aachen University in Germany and University de Lausanne in Switzerland and Harvard Medical School, he completed a PhD in brain imaging neuroscience and another PhD in computer science and machine learning statistics at Saclay and Neurospin France in 2016. Danilo currently serves as associate professor at the McGill's Faculty of Medicine and as Canada SciFar AI chair at MILA, Quebec Artificial Intelligence Institute, Montreal, Canada. And yeah, we are very honored to have such accomplished speakers here today. I feel like a total lazy person next to you. And welcome. And yeah, Victoria, the stage is yours. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Katarina. It's my pleasure. And as Katarina said, we are so excited to have you here. We feel that it's an honor to have both of you here sharing your work and taking out from your busy schedules. And so we want to, I hope that you can hear me okay. And Manisha, I will start with you, and the questions can be shared across both of you, of course. But I see you both have a hot mic too. So maybe it's, I don't know how long you've been on Clubhouse, but if you're not speaking, it's okay to mute your mic. And that way your mic is muted, and otherwise when you want to speak, go ahead and unmute. And so I will just start with this. I'm curious to hear, how did you find yourself in a life of science? Do you remember maybe a first time when something sparked your interest and you knew that science is something that you were loving and you wanted to just spend your life involved with, Manish?
Yeah, first of all, yeah, thanks for the introduction, Katerina. Yeah, my journey into science. So, I came from perhaps the unconventional path where I somehow, some way got very interested in meditation as a teenager, maybe around 15, 16 years old. And that drew me into reading a lot about, you could say, mysticism, East and West, and spirituality. And then through that, I got interested in the mind and of the concept of enlightenment, of being able to train our mind and refine the way we perceive the world, and just how much of our experience of life is dependent on ourselves, on our own perception of it. And eventually that led me to reading some books on psychedelics, in particular, the pioneering LSD psychiatrist Stanislav Grof, reading one of his books, which is it's called LSD Doorway to the Numinous. So I read this around age 18, something like this, and really opened my eyes to, the huge range of states that people can go into under the influence of a psychedelic, ranging from dreamlike visions of landscapes and having full conversations in your head, to experiences of expanding to the universe and feeling the sense of oneness, and it just the range of possible experiences a human can go through, and just the potential it might have for healing and insight and so on. And then so from there, I realized how these drugs are pretty stigmatized and people don't really recognize the possibility of these states, let alone their value. And so I kind of uh, got into a focus on science, particularly cognitive neuroscience and psychology, with an interest in rigorously studying these kind of airy, subjective phenomena, and just finding a way. It's like, how can we bring more credibility and rigor to these things that usually are seen as outside the domain of science? So yeah, so that's basically my path, and then I was lucky enough to meet the right people and get linked to the right labs to start moving in that direction.
I've so many questions, but I won't ask all the questions. But I find it interesting that you went toward psychedelics. I don't. I'm curious if it was perhaps your experience with meditation and noticing that there were experiences that could affect your inner life and or your thought process, and maybe that's what led you maybe externally towards psychedelics instead of continuing on a path in psychology.
Yeah, I guess you could say it was a fascination with introspection and exploring inner states and just reading broadly. And I don't remember how exactly I got into Stan Grof. I think it was perhaps just interest in psychoanalysis because he links himself to Carl Jung a lot. And somehow I came across it. I guess, it was a serendipitous way, and then it just really opened my eyes. And the connection to meditation is very clear in my mind, because it can be used to unlock these kinds of mystical states that usually were reserved for, ascetics or meditators or yogis, etc. And I just find it fascinating that basically a chemical key can unlock these really radical and profound states of consciousness. And that really, yeah, it's still fascinating to me.
It's just really meaningful that you're also sharing your work on YouTube, so you're making it accessible to people who may not be reading scientific journals or who are. But I just applaud you for taking that extra effort and bringing your research to more people.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that. Definitely, it was my intention to spread this knowledge in a rigorous way because there is a lot of pretty poor knowledge on the space as well. And so I really wanted to counter that.
Yeah, thank you, Manish. Danilo, it's your turn. Hello. Thank you so much for coming here and being with us um, in Science Society. And I'm curious about your path to your specialization. When did you decide that you were interested in sciences, and how did you find yourself where you are now?
Cool. Thanks so much. Thanks, Katerina, for the very generous introduction. Yeah, okay. Path to science. It's not easy to explain in a few sentences. Essentially, I was always interested in getting to the bottom of things and understanding underlying principles. What fascinated me most, let's say, in high school was really this question. What is fundamental about the human condition? How are humans different from other species? So that's of course a very broad and maybe unnecessarily broad question. The ways I started to explore this is by reading psychology, anthropology, philosophy. But somehow I thought that that may not be the most fruitful way to go forward. And I ended up starting by medicine to really learn the foundations of the biology of the body, but it was always in view of going towards neuroscience later on, and this is also what happened. So fast forward into the future, why psychedelics? My lab is not necessarily specialized in psychedelics. However, we see it as a great tool to open a mechanistically defined window into conscious awareness of humans and of human perception. And that is really what sparked our interest and of my team at McGill and Mila Quebec AI Institute.
Thank you. It's, it isn't trivial to hear what your path was toward your work today, because it gives us maybe a greater understanding when we hear more about your research, and it just deepens the interest. And for anyone who is exploring a path in the research that you're doing, I think it's helpful to hear how you got there, and it's just wonderful to hear, maybe get to know both of you a little bit more as people, included in your research. So thank you. I really appreciate your time. And Katarina, I'm going to turn the mic back over to you. And thank you both so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for that great, more personalized introduction. Yeah, the Danilo and Manish, the stage is yours to give us an overview over this really humongous psychedelic study. Thank you.
Okay, so what's useful questions to start? I would naturally talk about why psychedelics are relevant in general before we get to our particular study. Does this sound like a plan?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. So yeah, I'm just going to try to start. Manesh can then correct me and add to what I'm saying. So I think there's multiple dimensions and angles why psychedelics are really having prime time right now. As many of you probably know, it has been a taboo topic since the 60s, very little to no public funding for several decades, and now it's really coming back in a huge way. Why is that? Well, first of all, because of the growing realization that certain hallucinogenic drugs do confer benefits in major mental health conditions. And so by this, I mean schizophrenia, psychosis, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and so on and so forth. And what's particularly disturbing, the good disturbing, is that a single administration of some of those drugs, they can really induce long-lasting benefits even weeks and months later. So there is a potential to have a huge impact on the clinical treatment of psychiatric conditions. And that's particularly important because since the 80s, there was no quintessential improvement in the delivery of drug-based therapy in psychiatry. So that means that somebody who is treated for major depression in the Western world today, there's not so much difference from what we did 40 years ago. So from a more economic perspective now, that's also a very attractive arena to be in right now, because the mental health space is the largest fraction sector in general. And this is why it's all the more important to make a dent in this particular part of medicine. So what a lot of people don't usually expect is that the mental health space, in terms of costs, from a number of perspectives, is actually bigger than the entire cancer space. So that is why now that we see promise, there's, as far as I know, at least 200 startups and companies that started in that space over the last 5 to 10 years, say, and there's hundreds of millions of investments from big name venture capital companies. So as you can see, there's a lot of momentum in terms of basic science, clinical application, as well as economic exploitation. But I'm sure Manesh has other aspects to add.
Yeah, I mean, definitely that was a good summary. And it is really the clinical benefits on the treatment of mental health disorders that's spearheading this new wave of psychedelic research. And I mean, what's particularly fascinating about psychedelics and how they're different from, what you can call the standard pharmaceuticals or standard antidepressants is that they work through a fundamentally different way. With a standard antidepressant like an SSRI, you take it every day. And the basic idea essentially is that it's working behind the scenes in your brain to change, the chemical balance to basically reduce your symptoms and make you feel better. But with psychedelics, the treatment model is radically different, where you take it a limited number of times. So most of the clinical trials, you only take the actual psychedelic drug like psilocybin, which is a compound in magic mushrooms. You only take it 1 to 3 times. And there was a recent study from Johns Hopkins University where even at a year later, people had sustained reductions of depression. And I believe that was only from 2 or 3 sessions with the drug. Compare that with any other drug, in that year, you would have taken it 365 times probably. And the reason being, psychedelics induce an altered state of consciousness, which often allows people to gain insight into their life, to work through emotions they had previously been repressing, to kind of face the things they needed to face and which might be underlying their condition, whether it's trauma or just a adverse childhood experience in general, or just some kind of myopic thinking or a way they got stuck mentally. And just opening them up to kind of come back to themselves and reconnect with the world and change their behavior and their thinking in a more healthy, positive way. Of course, with the right psychological support. So in that way, psychedelics are this interesting treatment where it combines a drug intervention with psychotherapy, wherein the drug intervention it facilitates the therapeutic process through the experience it elicits. So psychedelics are this extremely unique case in that way, and a lot of people will argue are actually helping people resolve what's underlying their conditions rather than just pushing it under the rug and making you artificially feel better.
I have a quick question. So given that psychedelics and all sorts of other natural compounds are classified as Schedule 1 having no medical benefit, which obviously we can test here, how was it that these drugs are seeing the new development? Obviously, I understand in Canada it's a different set of regulations. Actually, curiously enough, now that I'm asking, is it also in the same class? Is there no known medical, or I don't really know what the legal structure is in Canada, and if nobody does know, then we don't have to get into it.
Yeah, I can answer that. So in Canada, yeah, it is, just as illegal at the moment as the States. In Canada, in order to allow to gain access to it for research purposes, there's something called the Section 56 exemption. So Health Canada, which is equivalent to the FDA, there are ways to send an application to be able to study these scheduled substances in a very controlled way and a controlled and regulated way. And I would imagine it's very similar for the FDA, where like reputable researchers and institutions could probably, through a lengthy bureaucratic process, be able to gain access in a very controlled and specific way for research. And this is kind of what's been going on.
Yeah, I think I have nothing more to say on this point. So are we done with the general background? Why psychedelics now? Or are there questions on the setting?
No, I think we're good about I'll ask my questions afterwards.
Okay. So a natural next step that the journalists usually ask at this point is, why did we now conduct our particular study? Does this sound like a useful point to attack right now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so let's go into it. So from my truest perspective, I think that there are a number of characteristics that are worth mentioning of how brain science and psychedelics has been done traditionally. And maybe I'm just going to portray the nature of a particular study like that as they are still done today. So you just need to imagine that it's something that takes multiple years. It costs several $100,000. And that is, for example, because it is a somewhat invasive type of study. And this is why there is a lengthy and detailed and complicated ethics approval process. That is one of the reasons why the traditional way to study psychedelics and imaging neuroscience is kind of slow. The next point is that it is logistically very challenging. So the participants, they need to come to the lab, take these drugs. It takes several hours. It is a very controlled type of setting. I don't know how many here have been in a magnetic resonance imaging scanner before. And so there's this very controlled, very specific, very detailed process and protocol of how to conduct these before, after brain scan type of studies, so with and without the influence of a drug. And that is, at the end of the day, why these studies usually have sample sizes, so number of participants, that are only in the dozens. Okay, so even some of the best studies in the space of psychedelics, if there's a brain imaging component, a brain scanning component, that we're usually talking about a few dozen subjects. So you probably already guessed where I'm going with this. And there are certain types of questions, certain categories of research questions that we may not be able to even tackle or start to tackle if we just have a few dozen subjects at our hands. And so the next point is, because it's so expensive, because it's so laborious, because there's so much preparation that goes into the classic mode of conducting psychedelic research, it is, as far as I know, also the case that only one or few psychedelic drugs can usually be examined in a same investigation. So, and that these shortcomings, these properties of this particular research community were precisely the motivation of why we took a drastically different approach. So first off, we wanted to conduct a study that really cuts across the various different types of hallucinogenic drugs that are out there. So in our particular study, trips neurotransmitters, we are lucky to have data from as many as 27 drugs, different compounds that are known and accepted, widely acknowledged to induce some form of hallucinogenic alteration. And just that by itself is already a huge difference from pretty much any other brain imaging study that has been done in that space before. But how can you do that? How can you actually study the effects of 27 neurotransmitters at the same time? And to answer that question, we had to design a completely new big data analytics approach. So we had to purpose design a quantitative analysis, a statistical approach to actually process this breadth of complex data. So what makes it different too is that we placed a huge premium on the text information. So the database that we analyzed literally only contains, just imagine, 7,000 Microsoft Word documents of 1 or 2 pages with free-form descriptions of hallucinogenic experience that the people wrote down after the experience. So the starting point is literally only a few thousand text documents. And so that is a very unusual way, a computational way, an in silico type of way, as we say, to get at the question of the underlying principles across 27 different hallucinogenic drugs. And what we really wanted to do, and what this setting allows us to do in a unique way, is to really get at the following question that, in my opinion, has not been asked in this way before, and that is, which types of above chance word occurrences are robustly associated with which particular archetypes, prototypes of hallucinogenic drug experience. So what do I mean by prototypes? So you probably all know that psychedelic experiences have different sensations, components. Those are changes in the motion, visual perception changes, auditory hallucinations, and one of the favorites, ego dissolution, the impression of becoming one with the world, for example. So what we really try to do is, is to computationally dissect this richness of drug-induced experience in a completely data-driven way to get at something like the personality types of psychedelic experiences and how they are very closely related to the precise neurotransmitter subsystems. So it's usually pretty confusing how we conducted this study. That's just the experience from 10 different interviews that I gave over the last few days. So I guess if there are questions on the starting point and how our study is different from the traditional way, I think it's a good moment to ask these questions.
I don't know if this is a good point. Maybe this is more appropriate after you talk about the results. But one of the issues that I've had in general with psychedelic studies, and this I think impacts the work that you did, are where is the data coming from? And does it represent a truly diverse population of folks that have had these experiences? Or does it represent a more culturally bound representation of these experiences, especially when these drugs are used within different religious expressions or cultural expressions? And that could alter the kinds of words that are used to describe the experiences that people have with them. So I wonder if you have any comments on that.
Okay, one way to think about it is, what's better, not to do a study or to get a reasonable first approximation to the question? We do not have very precise control over what is in the database that we analyzed. The database called Arrowhead, it's been out there for quite some time. It has not been analyzed in the way we tried before. We have partial information on the demographics of the participants that contributed to the study. But one way in which this database and this approach to analyzing this database departs from classical research avenues is certainly that we have much less control over who actually participated in these studies, because it's voluntary, because people could not say the truth. So that is, of course, a very big difference to the more standard ways to investigate psychedelics in the brain. And we hope, of course, that our proof of principle investigation motivates future more principled, more diverse, more demographically stratified and balanced ways to study language and the relation to how psychedelics impact the brain. But at this point in history, where we are right now, the Arrowhead database, with all its advantages and disadvantages, was, from my perspective, the only opportunity to ask the question, what are the underlying principles of semantic structure that people use to describe hallucinogenic experience, and the unique prototypes and archetypes and how they are related to specific neurotransmitter systems. So yes, we do not have full control over the demographics of this database, but without this database, we could never have done the study.
Yes, totally understood. And I'm actually very excited about this type of approach, but I'm always aware of the types of biases that can influence our results and the interpretation of the results, particularly selection bias.
If I
Thank you,
can
Doc.
quickly jump in.
Go ahead.
Sorry, Victoria. I was just going to say, I mean, if you compare this to the standard kind of experimental studies with a small cohort, I would say those are much more likely to be biased than this study, because this was, again, over 6,000 reports online of people who probably varied widely in why they were taking it, whether from partying, for introspection, for whatever. So I think this sample from Arrowhead is probably much more diverse than any controlled study as well.
Yeah, actually, you highlight my issue is that I think because I'm a psychiatrist, I'm a neuroscientist. I think about how these could apply to the patients that I see in my clinic, and I'm always sort of wary that if we're relying on data where people have taken these substances voluntarily or they've had positive experiences with them in the past, that could affect things like the placebo response to them. And so I'm very attuned to where is this data coming from and how generalizable is it?
And
Yeah,
maybe one quick point here. Let me just compare it to a recent development in psychology, which is mechanical Turk, right? So 10-ish, 10, 15 years ago, it's been still the standard in experimental psychology, inviting people to the lab, to this very controlled setting. And then suddenly there was this internet platform that allowed you to administer screen-based experiments all across the planet in exchange for something like a small salary on a per minute basis, right? Of course, all the psychologists, the traditional experimentalists, they were skeptical, but it turns out that this more crowdsourcing type of way to conduct experiments, at the end of the day, actually turned out to be more diverse and more balanced and more representative than a lot of the classic psychological studies that just turned out to be mostly conducted in young, late teen, early 20s, overly healthy, overly intelligent students that were much less representative than what could be done in the crowdsourcing type of way. So that's just an example to Manesh's point that he just made. In addition, this study is not yet very squarely focused on the direct translation to clinical practice. It tries to pave the way, plant an important cornerstone, but this study itself does not directly speak to therapy directly. So this is why we don't need to worry about this aspect at this point.
I have a question. So we were discussing self-selection bias and reporting and how that may influence outcomes. It's very interesting that you mentioned that perhaps it might lead to actually more diverse outcomes. I was wondering, is there a analog to self-selection bias within the clinical trial or the formal, what am I trying to say? I think we understand what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I think absolutely that's kind of that's why I'm bringing this up is because if you look at some of the studies that have been published out of the groups in England and at Hopkins, a lot of the folks that are involved in the clinical trials have actually had prior experience with psychedelics, and that's why they're volunteering for these studies.
That was what we found. We had a speaker last week, I believe it was, and when we were discussing the method section, that was part of the criteria because you don't necessarily want to take someone who's never experienced it and then ask them to be very good at describing what they experience. It's kind of like the first time you do anything, you kind of don't know what you're doing.
I should say that while like the fMRI and other like psychological studies are usually with people who are not psychedelic naive who've taken before, a lot of the clinical trials there are multiple clinical trials where they specifically look for people who didn't try before. I believe I might be wrong, but I think the escitalopram trial from Imperial College London had psychedelic naive people in it as well.
No, I don't think they were actually. That's one of the studies that I'm referring from Carhartt
Okay,
group.
then
Yeah,
maybe it's
they actually had quite a number of them, not all of them, but I think the majority actually had experience with psychedelics before.
okay, then maybe I'm thinking about the Hopkins, but yeah, but I think the point is not all of them, but you're totally right. I mean, again, it points to the infancy of the field, right? Like we want to ensure the safety in people who are less likely to have an aversive experience first before moving on to other people and expanding the population. Because yeah, even the inclusion criteria in these studies is very, very strict. Again, because it's very early days, and we don't want to exacerbate somebody's illness or have an unexpected aversive experience.
For those who don't know what the vaults of Erowid are, would someone like to just give a brief summary?
I mean, I guess I could. I mean, basically, Erowid is this long-standing website where people, it's basically created the community of what you can call psychonauts, which is like people who explore inner space, you could say, of people just reporting their experiences and sharing knowledge. And it's been around, I think, for at least a decade, maybe 2 decades.
At
And it's just
least
a
two.
Yeah, at least two. And it's this huge now. One component of the website is this huge repository or vault, as they call it, of trip reports with all the drugs you can ever think of and probably would never think of in all variety of ways. So it's just this huge crowdsourced, vault or repository of trip reports.
Yeah, if I may add, or I may add and then ask the question. So I did some everyday language analysis for assessing different mental states too, and I started with. I didn't start with. I went ahead later on and went through data analysis of different online forums because I. I read and I agreed that kind of this anonymous, voluntary way of sharing was the language um, was way more honest than in this clinical research settings where doctors and people that perform studies because I felt that the participants, if they like the people that perform the studies, they really want to do well and make a good impression. So it kind of, from my point of view, distorted the data a little bit. And then when you look at the forums, when people are frustrated um, or in like everyday situations where it's just hard, the language was because I also did the honesty analyzer, and for me it came out that the language was just way more honest. But just to give a little bit support there on the I got a lot of criticism from like reviewers for it, but I still felt like that was actually one of those studies were actually the best studies I did. But to ask now a question, it's really cool that you analyzed the language data. So can you talk a little bit about that, like how you did that and what your results were? Like how did the language differ, or what did it reflect? I think that's really interesting to me, at least.
Okay, there seem to be two separate questions here. The first is, how did we actually do the text analysis? And the second is, what are the results? Let's maybe start with the first one. So what's unusual is that we had a two-pronged approach in the first step. I already alluded to this. There are two sources of knowledge. The first is literally the unstructured Word document type of documents on the one hand side, and then on the other hand side, we considered not the drugs themselves, but their known pharmacological properties. So just imagine that we simply ignored which drug is which, what their names are, and so forth. We just represented each drug as a set of molecular binding affinities to 40 different neurotransmitter receptor subtypes. So those are the usual suspects: dopamine, serotonin, and so forth. And so how did we bring these two quite different types of data and information into contact now? And that is by machine learning tools that we translated from a field that's called natural language processing. So we adapted tools from natural language processing to get a hold of the deluge of text information from these 7,000 reports. So the way you can imagine this is like an Excel sheet where on the y-axis, the rows, it's the reports. So you have 7,000 different rows, roughly, and in the columns you have a specific word in each column. So where do these words come from? So this is all in a data-driven fashion. So we essentially look through all the reports and we build a list of all the notions that are mentioned at least once. And we perform a number of cleaning steps, such as we remove words that are very often used in English language and are therefore not indicative so much of the semantic meaning. And so the first step is to really arrive at two big matrices or two big tables, if you will. Both of them have 7,000 rows. One of them has, in our case, 14,000 columns. That's the words. And then so in that table, we really log how often has each word been used in a particular testimonial. Because we recode, re-express the information in this table form, you can already guess that this actually destroys the structure of the sentences, including the grammar. But this is one of the most common ways, most common starting points of natural language processing NLP type of pipelines. So we have this one table. On the other hand side, we have another table that includes the neurotransmitter receptor affinities that I already mentioned. So you have again 7,000 rows because those are the testimonials. And in the 40 columns, we have the pharmacological indicators of how likely a drug is to bind to each of the 40,000 receptors. So any questions up to this point, because it's very important to kind of that everybody's on the same page here. Any questions up to the point where we rehash, re-represent, restructure the data in the way I just described?
I think that was very clear.
Very clear. Okay, good. So you have these two hand sides. And now we do something that is the key idea probably, which hasn't been done before. So again, we ignore which drug is which. We just have this 40-dimensional representation of their binding profiles across the neurotransmitter verse in the brain, if you will. And now, once we have this natural language processing based encoding of these otherwise wild and unstructured testimonials, now we really get to the actual pattern learning analysis that is going to answer and at least try to get at the question, how are sets of word usages related to sets of neurotransmitter systems? And the particular method that we used here is called canonical correlation analysis. It doesn't really matter so much what this particular analysis exactly is. It could have been done by cousins, variants of this. There's no specificity for this particular pattern learning algorithm, but the basic idea behind it is important. So let me try to portray what it is doing from a more intuitive perspective. So first off, we are trying to find underlying principles, simplifying rules that drive the narratives, the semantic contexts of the various drug reports in general. So we are trying to find broad axes and dimensions of how sets of words from these hundreds and hundreds of reports co-occur in a systematic and robust way. And I can already mention at this point, we are quite surprised that worked very well. Because if you think that the reports, they are almost like Amazon book reports, anybody can submit something. So why should people consistently use the exact same words to describe their hallucinogenic experiences, right? It's not necessarily a given. And that was the first surprise that, au contraire, it actually worked pretty well. And there was a lot of agreement in the types of words that people naturally chose without any external instructions, just to remind you, of how they verbalized their particular experience post hoc after the fact. So, but it's more complicated than this because we have the same search for general principles, underlying axes, dimensions in the receptors on the other side, in the other axis sheet I just described too. And the trick is that these two search processes, they're directly coupled with each other. So we are not just looking for what are the driving principles of what words are used together to describe hallucinogenic experiences. We are also not asking what are the underlying principles and sets of neurotransmitter receptors that are inducing hallucinogenic states. No, we are asking which underlying principles in the semantic contexts across the 7,000 components are most robustly coupled with the underlying principles of neurotransmitter receptor combinations. So how are sets that explain most of the variation across 14,000 words most uniquely linked to sets of neurotransmitter receptor subsystems? So everybody on the same page up to here?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, that's good. So let me add one more aspect now for this particular, this first step of two in the analysis. So the additional point that that still comes here into play is that we're not just looking for one underlying principle on each side, on the receptor side and on the semantic side of these data, but we use an approach, a so-called latent factor approach, that allows to find several modes of co-variation between the receptors and between the word usages that are mutually complementary with each other. So let me resort to the analogy to personality again. Many of you probably heard about the Big Five personality model, right? An acronym, mnemonic for this is OCEAN, conscientiousness, openness, extraversion, and so on and so forth. And I think we can all agree that we can situate every human being on these five axes of being more or less extroverted, being more or less open, and so forth. So given this model of five major personality traits, we can situate each human on this five-dimensional, five axes dimensional graph, and each person would be a dot in this particular way to think about it. By analogy to personality, this is exactly what we did just in the example of hallucinogenic experiences and receptors. So we asked, are there maybe several of these prototypes that are complementary to each other and uncorrelated with each other that together describe the overall experience? So, and that is important, just to recap, because as I'm sure you know, a psychedelic experience has all these different aspects to them. I give some examples. Hallucinogenic alterations of auditory perception, visual perception, being submerged emotionally, losing the boundary between self and the world, space-time distortions, and so on and so forth. What we try to do is, can we actually tease those different aspects of the psychedelic experience apart to come up with a collection of the underlying elementary experience components? And so to make the turn to the results now, we were again surprised, I'm happy to admit, how well that worked, because indeed the first prototypes of these co-variations between sets of 40,000 words and sets between these 40 neurotransmitter receptor subsystems, they did indeed capture these classic aspects that people naturally describe to be mixed in seemingly random ways in the particular anecdotes of hallucinogenic experiences. Okay, so I hope I made roughly a good job of explaining this first of two steps of the analysis.
Yes, Daniel, I think that was a really great explanation. Maybe I can just give the very, very bare bones summary in case you may have lost some people. I think how I might say it is that, basically what you guys did was find how sets of receptors and how sets of receptors relate to sets of testimonials, sets of trip reports. So, and then you can view it as a set of receptors which are being activated, and then a set of trip reports which correspond to specific drugs. So you get groups of drugs in the end which relate to groups of receptors, and then you can go further a step and see what words were most common in those drugs that are associated with the receptors. So therefore, you eventually get this plot, as you can see if you guys looked at the figure, where it's linking sets of drugs in different proportions to different receptors in different proportions, and then the words that are most common in those sets of drugs, which again relate to those receptors. So it's again linking sets of reports across different drugs to sets of receptors in the brain. Hopefully that was helpful.
I just wanted to comment. I really love how you bring such a systematic analysis into the subject finally. It's really helpful, I think, for um, helping people making that they feel like they make a rational decision on maybe in the future using these drugs as a treatment. So I think you did a great contribution to that with this work, and yeah, it's really amazing that people with really systematic and computational skills tackle this in this way. It's really great. So Victoria, I'm sorry, you wanted to say something.
No, I was just mic flashing. I was applauding and agreeing with you. It's just, I think a definition of creative work is to be able to take something out of context and to, because I don't want to repeat what you just said. So yeah, I was just applauding your words. Thanks.
Yeah, if you want to go ahead and ask a question, please feel free to do so. I know a few people. Oh, Dennis, did you unmute yourself?
I did, but I want to leave some room for others to ask questions. I was very excited for the findings, but we'll take some time to get there.
Dennis,
Do you
please go
have,
ahead.
oh,
Don't
sorry.
interrupt the flow.
Who was that?
A-
Oh,
I
Andrew, go ahead with your question. Mark also joined the stage. Welcome everybody who has just joined the stage. Flash your mics if you have questions. We'll go Andrew, then Mark, and if anyone else has questions, please flash your mic.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for allowing me to ask a question on stage. Dr. Danilo, I hope I'm addressing you the right way. Would there be, for let's say, for newbies that experimented briefly, let's say, with things like cannabis, and then maybe psilocybin, is there? I'm sure you are reluctant to give practical advice or even suggest doses, but if you were to indulge, what doses would you recommend for someone to start with?
Well, was there any information in these reports regarding dosage is actually an interesting question.
Yes, we have partial information on the doses. It's just that, yeah. So from my understanding, for these compounds in particular, it's quite difficult to measure. So from a limited experience, Manesh probably knows this better. If you just imagine these mushrooms, so in some mushrooms you just have more active substance than in others. So you can't just go by the weight alone And that's just one example. The second example would be, I think it also depends on the way people store the particular compounds. So there could be drying and effects and so forth. So it really depends on a number of factors.
Oxidation.
How much active substance is actually in a particular psychedelic substance. So from my perspective, it's not actually so easy to know how much there's going to be in a particular dose in front of you, even if the weight is correct. Okay, assuming that the weight is correct. And since it's all self-report, we can't be 100% sure that the weight is correct. We did perform some analyses related to the dose. Those were mostly control analyses. You can find those at the end of the results section if you look into the preprint. But the combination with the doses is an interesting aspect, but that's not the main focus of our present study. To get back to the first question that we had, okay, I'm a medical doctor, but I'm certainly not qualified to give practical advice on consumption of these substances here in this context.
If you want further information on that, you can look potentially to the studies out of Johns Hopkins. However, those studies were conducted on synthetically sourced psilocybin, so it's not full spectrum product. And then there's also an interesting aspect in terms of being able to metabolize these substances. I don't know if this applies in this context. I imagine it does, though. There are people who are very efficient at metabolizing, medium, low, and perhaps even they cannot metabolize the substance whatsoever.
Yeah, along those lines, in addition to what Danilo said, it's particularly with stuff, well, I guess any drug you get on the black market, you don't know what exactly you're getting or what dosage. Even mushrooms can, yeah, vary very, very widely in their potency, like by multiple like orders of magnitude. Like, well, you can get 1 gram in one sense, which is as strong as 4 grams of another strain. So it's very unreliable. And definitely liver enzymes play a huge role as well. There's a particular family called the cytochrome P450, which really, if you have a certain gene polymorphism in relation to that, you can really ramp up your sensitivity to a psychedelic. And there's also other differences in personality and just the density of receptors in your brain, which also can change it. So it's very tough to make generalized recommendations on dose. You just have to be very careful and always
Yeah.
start lower.
Manish, I have a question for you and then a brief question for Danilo, and then I'll stop myself. I will not take the mic over again. Manish, I was inspired with this following question from basically your bio. The first 2 lines in your bio says, neuroscience PhD student studying how psychedelics work in the brain. Okay, so let's entertain that idea for a second. Technically speaking, so both Manish and Danilo, let's say if Dr. Danilo, if you consume psychedelics such as psilocybin, let's say during sleep, right, where your mind is not active, but it can still have an effect on the brain from like an architectural perspective, like hardware perspective, and then on the software perspective, what would be the result post sleep, the affect on the mind, opposed to just having a direct effect on the mind and experiencing it live. Are there benefits to use psychedelics such as psilocybin offline in terms of the mind and just allow the effects on the brain? I'm sorry if it's too silly of a question or too complex.
No, I understand what you're saying. I mean, there are some interesting studies, I think, from the 50s and 60s with LSD, giving it to people while they're sleeping or right before they sleep, and it's been known to induce REM sleep actually, and induce basically dreaming in a state of kind of a sleep stage associated with dreaming, and a kind of paradoxical wakefulness in your brain while you're sleeping. So that has been found before, but I think in most cases it's kind of hard to fall asleep if you take a psychedelic right before. they're quite stimulating in a lot of cases. And the other point you're making is essentially the question of, is there stuff that psychedelics are doing behind the scene independent of experience that can be beneficial? And that's actually a big topic of discussion in the field now, because psychedelics boost neuroplasticity in the brain, and neuroplasticity alone in rodents has been found to reduce depression and anxiety symptoms, for example. So the thought is, independent of the psychedelic experience, psychedelics seem to be able to possibly reduce these symptoms of depression. And so that very much is a possibility, but in any case, you're not going to be able to avoid the experience, at least with psychedelics as they are now, because it's going to induce the experience if you ingest it, and that's going to be a part of the effect it has on you psychologically. Although
And a quick
many
follow-up
companies,
question
yeah.
would be: would it be ethical to give psychedelics such as LSD or psilocybin to people in coma?
That is a very interesting question. And ethical, I don't know, I can't speak to that, but it's very interesting because, for example, a lot of consciousness researchers have noticed that, when you're under anesthesia or in a kind of coma vegetative-like state, essentially your brain's, you could say, activity or dynamics become less complex. And when you try to kind of stimulate it, the reaction is less complex. But with psychedelics, it's actually your brain is more complex than it is in your normal waking state. So it's like a hyper awake state when you're under a psychedelic in terms of your brain's responsiveness. And so there are people who have speculated, and in particular, I'm thinking of a researcher from somewhere in South America, and they've raised the possibility that it could be useful for people with so-called disorders of consciousness in helping them retain some level of conscious awareness when they previously lacked it. But this is very much the frontier, and it hasn't really been conducted yet, and there are ethical hurdles. But it is actually, in principle, something that could be possible in the future.
I'm not aware of any studies that have been formally done in unconscious patients. That is an interesting question.
I had a comment about the sleep. So that's interesting that you say that induces REM sleep in the, because I had this theory, my own theory, uh, just to put it out there, that maybe I thought because psychedelics put you like in this a very intensive states, mental states, that maybe people that have very, very intense dreams are kind of have kind of a natural way of inducing these states and are kind of protected from mental health disorders. And interestingly, this last week, there came a paper out that actually said they pinpointed 4 genes, I think, to people that have really good quality of sleep, and that in that subpopulation they are very protected from mental health disorders and also later on neurodegenerative disorders such as dementia and Parkinson. I thought it was quite interesting, and that you mentioned that I didn't realize that these psychedelics could induce these REM states. Thank you for that.
Fascinating. Do you happen to recall any of the genes that those were?
Oh, I have to look it up. It's somewhere in my Twitter.
Okay, we'll get back to that point.
Yeah.
I was going to say, Katerina, that makes a lot of sense clinically when looking at the impact of SSRIs on sleep architecture and REM sleep in particular, where you see basically delayed REM latency, but patients will subjectively report more intense and vivid dreams. And the other folks on the stage can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think some of the um, neural circuits that are engaged in REM sleep are also involved in some of the clinical responses seen in the psychedelic trials.
They work off of some of the same receptors, so it stands to reason that they would have some of the same effects. So, serotonin receptors, for example, right?
Yes, that's my understanding. But I'd be curious to hear from the authors of the article too.
Yeah, I can't say much about sleep. That's just not my area of expertise. I agree that sleep is often a problem, mental health conditions. So now you can ask what comes first. Maybe there's some interaction going on. I agree that in neurology, neurodegeneration, for example, Alzheimer's, impaired sleep is definitely contributing as a risk factor towards people developing that condition. That's all I can say, but I can't really put it in the context of psychedelics myself.
If I may suggest, since it's getting a bit late, at least for us on the East Coast, Danilo, would you like to walk through some of the main results and then maybe figure 1, 2, and 3, or however you see it?
Yeah, why don't we just talk about the results? So some of the key results were quite surprising to us. And first off, the one I like to mention first is really the one on serotonin as the most important receptor in the hallucinogenic experience or not. So more specifically, I think it's 5-HT2A. So there's a particular serotonin subreceptor around which a lot of the psychedelics literature revolved for a number of years. Of course, people have been hypothesizing that there may be other receptors involved, and there's probably combinations and so on and so forth. However, when I read the papers, when I tried to read this literature, it was very much my impression that there is something like a serotonin centrism in this particular pocket of the neuroscience community. So through this impartial, data-driven, data-first type of approach that we carried out, we came to the conclusion that all the prototypes that we identified, ego dissolution, auditory hallucination, visual alterations, and so forth, each of them was really robustly associated with a whole set, a whole combination, a larger, wider group of neurotransmitter receptors. So at least the way in which we conducted the analysis, under the particular modeling assumptions that we made, we did not find strong evidence that serotonin is necessarily special in how hallucinogenic drug experience comes about. Or to say it from another perspective, based on our data, it looks much more to be the case that there are complicated combinations of neurotransmitter receptors that do involve serotonin, but it's really heterogeneous groups of neurotransmitter receptors that are flagged, highlighted by our analyses. And I think that actually stands to reason, because if you think about the diversity of the experiences, I gave examples, why should those be generated by a single type of neurotransmitter receptor? I think it's much more likely that there's this heterogeneous set. Okay, did I succeed in explaining this first key finding?
I think so. I hope at some point we'll get to what the number one word is. I'm really waiting for that that factoid.
Well, the number one words, as Manesh explained very well, they depend on the prototype. So the number one words for something, for the archetype related to ego dissolution, for example, were words that are associated with mystical experiences, alien, universe, galaxy, planet, Earth, words of that nature. Then we had a component that was more tuned to auditory hallucination, auditory alterations of perception. There, the top words among the 14,000 candidates were typical words related to sounds. So sound, sounds, pitch, tone, music, and so on and so forth. And in the emotional components, you obviously had descriptions of emotions, so fear, overwhelmed, and so on. We also had a somatosensory component. I haven't mentioned that one yet. So oftentimes during hallucinogenic experiences, there can also be a number of bodily sensations. And so we did find, so our approach did flag the more visceral types of words to, like stomach, for example. So it really flagged in a very clean way words that from our interpretation of the data went very well and in very direct ways with these prototypes that I mentioned. Does this answer the question for the top words?
I was curious, so you said 40,000 words total in the analysis, was that right?
14,000, yeah.
14, okay. So of the
Yes.
14,000, I understand you broke them down by type, but was there a number one word aggregate for all different
No.
types?
Well, kind of. The answer is, you have an answer like this per prototype. That's just how the analysis works.
Got it. Okay. Right on.
So we didn't really look at the single most important word. That would be an interesting question. I admit we have not looked
That's
at
an
that.
exciting question. Let me
But
know when you have the update.
yeah. So, but the top words, it was quite surprising to us. And again, I'm happy to admit we did not expect, is what I wanted to say, that this would turn out that well. But the flag words, they were indeed very close to what we expect.
Can I comment on the main
Sure.
finding as well?
Yes.
So I'm not sure if everyone saw the paper in the first figure. So perhaps this is what you guys were trying to ask of Danilo, and maybe the question framing was not ideal, I guess. But like the first prototype, as Danilo was calling it, which links different drug reports to different receptors. So the words most associated with that. So these prototypes have two sides to them, two axes. So you could think of it as a spectrum from one end to the other end. And so the first one, which explained the most variants, or just explained the most in terms of the trip reports and drug receptors, was something on one end, which was visuals, was the biggest word, and the other end was reality. So it's really interesting to me, thinking about the phenomenology of psychedelics. So the side with visuals had other stuff as well, but it seemed to more so relate to kind of sensory processes, like feelings in your body and your perception. Whereas the other side, the reality side, which was most associated with the drugs DMT, salvinorin A or salvia, and 5-MeO-DMT, which have a very unique profile of seductive effects if anybody's familiar with them, the words associated with those were reality, universe, space, inhaled, because you smoke all three of those, world, consciousness, breakthrough. And so this is essentially, in my mind, Danilo and the crew who wrote this paper framed it as ego dissolution, but perhaps another way to view it is it's separating kind of sensory phenomena of sensory perception from the experience that your reality itself has been displaced or translocated or something like this. And this is a very common type of report you hear with DMT and salvia and 5-MeO-DMT, and also ketamine, which are ranking high on that side of the reality. And so basically this main dimension of difference across trip reports and across trip reports and receptors is separating the experience of basically feeling like you broke through into a different reality and lost sense of your initial existence. And even the word entity is pretty high on that list. And it's a very common experience for people to report under DMT of experiencing this alternate dimension, if you will, where they contact entities and feel like they're communicating with beings. Far out, but like, hey, research has studied this. And for example, Chris Timmerman, who's a postdoctoral researcher at Imperial College London, has did his PhD on DMT and characterizing these types of experiences that people have. And so it's fascinating that the main way of separating was visual sensory phenomena versus kind of almost dissociative reality translocation expansion experience associated with other drugs. So I found that to be particularly fascinating.
Wow. It's actually really interesting how you raised this parallel of several of those class of substances was inhaled and then the word was also associated with it. So, yeah, interesting correlation, huh?
Yeah, thanks for Manish uh, adding this explanation of the background. So for the figure one, I'm actually looking at the paper. It would be great. I mean, probably the Danilo has explained before, which I missed. For the visual, the two columns words on the left of the figure one. As I understand, figure one is for the factor one, which is ego dissolution. The at the beginning, I heard you say it seems to me machine learning type of approach is a bag of words. You just scramble all the structure, right? Structureless bag of words. But now there are two of them, at least two layers. How do you decide on these, the blue and the red?
Yeah, that's a part that is naturally hard to explain from our perspective, and it's part of the reason why we resort to this personality trait analogy. So, what each of the prototypes is, it's really an axis along which a particular hallucinogenic experience expresses itself more on the positive side or leaning more into the negative side. So as a first approximation, you can really think about it as the same as, let's say, extraversion and introversion. Um, it just describes the aspect of introversionness. And one pole of this axis has very extroverted people, and the other extreme of that axis has flex or characterizes people at the
Does it have
opposite
to
end of
do
the
with
spectrum.
the interpersonal relationship aspects or intrapersonal relationship aspects? The self-talk or the way we communicate with others and interact with others?
Well, I'm trying to give kind of an analogy to how it's different. So the point is essentially what's blue, what's red, it doesn't really matter so much. We could flip the colors, the meaning is exactly the same. It's more about what are the words, what are the receptors that get flagged at the very extremes. It doesn't really matter which is the plus or the minus or positive or negative or whatever. It's just about the fact that if you establish one axis, one prototype, one archetype of hallucinogenic drug experience, it can express itself. It can be very present, or it can be very not present. So I hope this roughly helps. I hope this roughly answers the question.
So
I have another
among these.
question. I'll wait. Frank, please.
Yeah, thank you,
Mhm.
Andrew. So among the 14,000 words, how many are blue? How many are red?
Well, just imagine it's roughly half. It's roughly half
Okay,
half.
great. Thank you. So that's very interesting. So for the figure one, could you use one example? For example, I believe you said serotonin, the red on the top or right, the SHT2A, and the blue bottom is the D1. How do these so apparently these two are the extremes, right? So they probably very exemplary in your uh, uh, research methodology, like mapping to the brain area, cortex area.
So let me put it this way. The biggest strength is also maybe the biggest weakness of this approach. So why am I saying that? So um, we can only identify groups of transmitters that go with groups of words. So of course they are relevant in a continuous way, right? Each receptor is relevant to a particular extent, and each word is related to a particular extent. But what this approach, what our study does not answer, is the unique contributions of a single receptor, or the unique contributions or the unique associations and linkages of a particular word usage with neurotransmitter receptors. Because I understand that is your question. We can only talk about constellations of them.
Yeah. Dr. Danilo and Manesh, I have a question for you too. A bit of disclaimer. At best, this will sound taboo. At worst, it will sound controversial, but let's not kid ourselves. We're talking science here. We are mammals, and let's say from a B.F. Skinner-esque perspective, provided that we are mammals, what role does libido play? For example, there's a phenomena called post-coital dysphoria, and we know that there is a euphoria, in anticipation of sex. But for example, is there any difference to be made between libido as a drive, sexual satisfaction, let's say post-coital, and the effect psychedelics has on us pre or post sex? Again, provided that post-coital dysphoria is a real phenomenon.
How many times was sex mentioned in 14,000 words?
Maybe not sex, but libido, I would say, is the continuum.
Yeah, I don't think I can say much about that. We didn't pay attention to this aspect, and I'm not sure this really came out in the results in any strong way.
Manesh?
I mean, this is, yeah, certainly not something I can comment on. I don't believe of any research being done on that, or in
Let's
particularly,
do some research, gentlemen.
Beyond the scope, of the study, for the time being. Perhaps you can update us if you find anything of that nature.
By the way, we have Wissam down in the audience. I think he will, participate to the conversation and add value.
For sure. Just to check in with Danilo and Manesh, how much time do you all have with us left?
I do personally a bit overtime and ready to wrap up very soon. I do have to go.
Okay. You can if you need to go, feel free to go. We're very pleased to have you, but if you gotta go for it. Danilo?
Yeah, maybe one or two final questions.
Okay, that sounds good. Moderators, are there any final questions at this time? Flash your mic.
Yeah, thank you. I did want to add, because Danilo, when you began your talk, you had said, I think, based it on, this is what the journalist had asked you before, and I wanted to assert this is your talk. So if there was something that you had wanted to bring up that we hadn't thought of asking, then please do.
Great prompt. Yes. Is there anything we haven't touched on that you feel is important?
Yeah, let me maybe emphasize one thing that I alluded to in the beginning already. So I really think that psychedelics are this formidable tool to study conscious awareness changes. So why is that? because the because the big C word, consciousness, that's of course a very broad notion. It's something that's very hard to define. We have not made final definitive progress on how to best define these very challenging notions. And as you can imagine, it's very difficult and tricky to come up with careful, rigorous experiments to study any aspects of how, quote unquote, consciousness is related to aspects of the brain, right? So I think it's easy to appreciate that studying this very noble notion is very difficult for neuroscience traditionally. So how has this been done in the past? Let me just give two examples of two extremes of how neuroscientists try to study consciousness. So one way is the very theoretical way. I'm not going to say names of particular scientists, but you can imagine that there's a couple of armchair theories of very theoretically oriented neuroscientists that come in from what you might call a top-down perspective. So they design and come up with axioms and principles of how they think what the components of human consciousness should be. However, a big weakness of these theories of consciousness, of a lot of them, is that they are not really falsifiable. So that means that they are so abstract, they are so out there, if you will, that it's very difficult to define experiments that could definitively verify or falsify aspects or the overarching theories. So we can not really bring them into contact with the actual experiments that we can do in organisms. So that's the very theoretical pole. The other pole would be attempts to study conscious awareness of sensory stimulation. So as a very quick example, other scientists who shall remain unnamed in this context, they have, for example, administered subliminal stimulation. So very quick flashes of images on a screen, for example, for a very small number of milliseconds, such that the subjects were not or barely aware that there actually has been a visual stimulus in front of them. Okay, and by modulating how subliminal certain visual stimuli presentations were, they could study how this relates to neural activity responses. However, for this particular approach, these class of ways to attack the big C word, I would personally argue, I find it unlikely that visual stimuli are a potent tool to really capture the entirety and the complexity and the richness of conscious experience in humans. So I think that the combination of semantic deconstruction of complex human experience and the known, bringing to the table the known pharmacological properties of many of these drug compounds, this really is situated at a sweet spot between this very theoretical top-down and this somewhat tip of the iceberg, in my personal perspective, type of approach, where you really just look at subliminal sensory stimulation and you don't really get to the full richness of and the complexity of human consciousness. So I think I hope I convinced you why and why I'm convinced that psychedelics and this exciting emerging stream of literature, as it takes momentum, it also sharpens and hardens the methodologies and tools that we have to make a serious next attack of unraveling some of the neuroscience principles that implement aspects of human conscious experience. Any questions?
Yes. So we had here Dr. Michael Levine. He was talking about his new framework about mind everywhere. So basically a new
So just for the record, I was not talking about him.
I know you weren't, but your work, especially with using natural language processing, do you think that based on your work, you will get maybe the best possible or one of the better frameworks of testing consciousness in future artificial minds?
Very quickly before Danilo, before you respond, I'd like to interject. I do have to go, so I just want to say thank you to the hosts and thank you, Danilo, for inviting me. It's been really great to chat about this with all of you. So I hope you all have a great rest of the day or a great night.
Thank you for
Thank you so much for joining us,
Thank you.
Mahesh. Definitely come back in the future if you ever see our rooms. We'd love to have you on stage and
Sure,
join
thanks.
us in our discussion.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thanks for
Thank you.
joining.
See you,
Thanks so
Manish.
much. See you. Bye.
Okay, so what was the last question? Artificial minds. Okay, So last answer. So that's, of course, a very far-reaching question that gets at the nature of neuroscience and AI, right? Can we use principles from the brain to inform the design of new machine learning algorithms? So that would be neuro to AI, or its opposite. Can we study the nature of machine learning algorithms in computer science to better study, frame, experiment, analyze aspects of how the human brain works? I think psychedelics can serve and play important roles for both of these directions as we understand some of the underlying principles of human conscious awareness a little bit better. This can, in my personal opinion, do spark new directions of research in the machine learning community too. And it is heavily discussed indeed in the machine learning and deep learning communities. To what extent the algorithms that exist today, or we may have in the immediate future, do mimic or even reflect some aspects of conscious awareness. Does this answer the question?
Yeah, so there's a lot of discussion out there if we have already some simple form of emerging consciousness, or how to test for it if we have it, because it generates ethical questions and what to do, if it's safe to have them or if it's even safer to have. So based on you, because we can train those systems to have a natural language, to spit out natural language, can we, based on your data analysis, test more reliably for consciousness in AI maybe one day?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can really add more than what I said in my previous answer, to be
Yeah,
honest.
thank you. Yeah,
I think it covers that one too,
yeah.
in my opinion. Okay, so I think I have to go, similar to Manesh. So thanks so much for the invitation. Thanks for the exciting discussion and the questions. It's been very interesting and stimulating. And I'm looking forward to the next episodes of this series.
I really appreciate Dr. Daniel and Danilo. Just quickly before you go, I'm so fascinated by your research, and just to verify that I understand the theme. I mean, the most important message of your paper that are correct. Just verify with you that for example, the figure one. So basically the assumption here is the visual ones more to the lower level cortex function, like sensory, and reality is more higher level abstract. But that, if that's correct, that got me a little bit curious of the sagittal. I mean, if you look at the highlighted color area, isn't that the green and blue one are the sensory or motor cortex section, versus the posterior. That's correct. That's more visual. But there's also red ones. Seems to be the orange ones in the anterior, more associative cortex. Do I get the part correct or completely wrong? Hello.
Yeah, I think maybe we can invite Dr. Danilo back. I think he left.
Oh,
So
okay. Sorry.
sorry about that. Yeah. So yeah, thank you for all the great questions today. I think this was a really interesting study. It has so much data. We would probably, as Dr. Danilo said, more episodes of this topic to discuss all the data now, because I think we got mostly to how they did this and why, but not really, we didn't get to do a deeper dive into the data itself. So we should definitely, I'll reach out to invite them back. And yeah, thanks everyone.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. I mean, it's definitely interesting the paper. Just maybe we didn't get to hear enough time. Yeah. Again, really appreciate everyone's question and the speakers. I think he's left, right? But his profile is still there.
Yeah, I think they were tight.
Yeah,
So yeah,
he
thank
gave
you.
us the outro, and he's out. And let's wrap up the room. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll definitely invite them back. I'll try to invite them back. And yeah, thanks everyone. I think this was a great room. Thank you, Victoria, so much for the introduction. You do such a great job at this interviewing process, so I really appreciate that. Yeah, and uh, just as every time, please follow the Science Society if you like discussions like this. We have tomorrow Dr. Liu here. He is actually the founder of one of the NSF institutes. He's a really accomplished scientist, and he will discuss his new theory of entropy, with which he solved and is solving material design problems. The name of his entropy theory is Zentropy. He's a really fascinating scientist, and yeah, his talk will be really interesting. So join us tomorrow at the same time, and then on Friday, I will reconfirm, but we have Dr. Chen talking about the new study how lithium use changes the incidence of dementia. It's a really interesting new study that he came about, and yeah, and then we'll have rooms again next week with more guest invited speakers. So follow the club. We have almost every day guest speakers, and yeah, we'll start. We are planning to start to have a weekend recap room where we kind of summarize for everyone that couldn't make the rooms for whatever reason during the week, because weeks are busy, to have like summaries of what happened in our science society, because also it can get overwhelming. We have so many cutting edge new studies discussed with really new technology and new inventions and science. So we are planning to do a recap room on the weekends. I'll announce it in the next room, to give people another time chance to ask questions, and also to give input about what they would like to talk about again, or so yeah, stay tuned for that. And yeah, thank you everyone. If any one of the moderators here has something to add that I forget all the time, please do.
Thank you.
Just follow the club. There's Science Society on top.
I was trying to click back to find my mic. But should make the mic, the team needs to make the mic follow whichever screen we're on. I'll go make that suggestion. So yeah, thank you. This was great. Thank you, everyone. Follow the club.
Yep, thank you, and see you again, or hear you again soon. So close the room in 3, 2, 1. Bye everyone.
Thanks, everyone.